So one thing I hear young adults often talk about regarding the sex trade is issues concerning pornography, camming, and sugaring, and treating them or talking about them as if they're all the same thing. So I'm curious, what are your thoughts in regards to online facilitated sexual interactions, and specifically, should they be treated differently than prostitution?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I feel like we should start off talking about pornography, because I think a lot of people think of pornography as being separate from prostitution, in that there are more contracts and there's more regulation around it. So people may think that pornography is safer than prostitution, right? Also, I think the idea that it's done behind a camera gives people this impression that it is safer and that there's more regulation going on behind the camera. But the reality of the situation is that the intersecting oppressions that fuel prostitution are the same as those that fuel pornography, right? Like when you're searching for pornography online, often people will look up videos by someone's race, by a specific body part. They'll pick apart people's identities and fetishize them, and people find pleasure in that. And the same thing happens in prostitution. In legal brothels, there are different floors that will say, okay, there's one floor for Black women, one floor for trans people, and then buyers come in and select what pieces of people's identity that they want to fetishize and sexualize. And the same thing happens in pornography. And not only that, it's also harmful for the viewer to be watching pornography. Studies show that for people who view pornography, it is a higher chance that they will view women as objects, that there's a higher chance that they will commit sexual assault or sexually violent acts. So not only is it harmful for people behind the camera, people in pornography, right, who are often subjected to the same adverse childhood experiences as people who enter prostitution, but it's also harmful to the viewer.
Yeah. I mean, pornography has really been quite well studied at this point, but I feel like more recently, camming, OnlyFans has really become a lot more popular, and I feel like it almost brings people a lot more comfort in taking part in camming, or I mean, I feel like everyone has this OnlyFans chant, like that's where I can really like hustle, quote unquote, for money, where I can really portray some like form of female empowerment. But in reality, there's so much technology facilitated abuse that becomes very rampant on these sites through this online facilitation of a sexual interaction. And more importantly, these often become the breeding grounds for grooming that then takes that interaction that may begin as a virtual interaction and then it becomes something physical. And it becomes a breeding ground for young children, minors, to often then engage because they might just have access to the internet and might feel like it's safe because they're not in touch with someone physically, but ultimately it just becomes quite a scary experience and how it could really transform into this larger violent picture.
Yeah, and I think something that people don't know is a lot of accounts on OnlyFans are actually run by third parties. They're effectively run by pimps, right? People think that because it's online that there's more agency in the person who's behind the camera, but the reality is that's actually not the case.
Right. And there's this glamorization of going on these sites, having an account, like really kind of showing it off on some level as something that's very safe. In fact, something that's very encouraged for young women especially, when I feel like it's hiding this very dark and violent underbelly.
Yeah, I know that you also brought up sugaring. And I think a lot of the times we're like, okay, wait, sugaring feels like the odd piece here. You know, sugaring is thought about this idea where it's transactional, but it's transactional and you're just exchanging companionship. You're just going out to dinner. You're sending a few texts. And personally, I think that makes it all the more dangerous because people don't go into sugaring expecting for them to be exchanging sexual acts. And in reality, we do know that that is not the case, that absolutely once that exchange is done, once the money is transferred over by the sugar daddy or the sugar mommy, that the power is in control of that person who handed over the money. There's not a contract. The person who is the sugar baby does not have control over, you know, what they want to do, how far they want to go. And then I think it's really interesting because when you think about sugaring, you understand that there should be an age difference just because of, you know, the sugar daddy is seen as like this wealthy older gentleman, and then a sugar baby is seen as usually a younger person who is just seeking to get, you know, some extra cash, or, you know, some kind of glamorous experience that they're seeking to explore. And if we, you know, leave the sex trade and we look at, for example, those age dynamics in like a relationship, I feel like now we're having a lot of more conversations, specifically our generation, about how grooming really can occur and like those red flags when there is that age difference in relationships. But for some reason, when we talk about sugaring, that completely escapes the conversation. Like there's no conversation of like the potential grooming that can occur. And then you don't even talk about how the exchange of money and how coercive money can be, how that just exacerbates the power dynamic within sugaring. So I feel like we definitely have to keep an eye on sugaring sites as well, because it includes the same harms.
Yeah, absolutely. Like the age gap creates an unhealthy power play, and also the financial gap creates an unhealthy power play that can be like very dangerous, especially when someone is looking to exit a sugaring relationship. It can make that very difficult. And another thing is that sugaring is almost looked at as something empowering within like our community and within our generation. And the issue with that is that we all seem to have this idea, or not all of us, but I've noticed that a lot of people in our generation have this idea that the idea that sugaring is empowering is a thought that is original to us, that came from us. But in fact, if you look at social media, like our media in general, you know, the music that we listen to, the things that you know, are put on our For You page, a lot of it is actually this narrative of, you know, giving the goods in order to get something in return, to get that monetary in return. And if you really think about that, that in itself is prostitution, and that's being sold to us in our media. So a lot of these things aren't ideas that are original within us. They are actually sold to us by people that aren't even participating in this and in prostitution in their own lives. So yeah, it's very interesting to think of how sugaring is actually disempowering and being sold to us.
Yeah, totally. And I think something that a lot of people don't know is Seeking.com, formerly Seeking Arrangements, which is probably one of the most popular sugaring sites out there, actually markets their site to students. If you use an EDU email, you get like more access into like the account and the site. So they're actively seeking out people who are in financially disadvantaged positions, right? Students are, one, their full-time job, right, hopefully is them being a student. That's not always the case. So they're trying to make money on the side in order to, you know, keep up with extracurriculars, things going on outside of the classroom. Maybe they've moved to a new place. They don't have a network of people who can support them financially. But also, they need to pay for tuition. Not everyone is so lucky to have parents who can pay for their tuition. And Seeking actually put out information online that said that the number one profession of sugar babies is student, and that a lot of them use the money they get from those arrangements to pay for tuition. So the sites, like you were saying, like our generation thinks that sugaring is an idea that, you know, we came up with, but in reality, it's something that the people who really benefit from sugaring relationships, the people who are paying sugar babies, right, created to prey on vulnerable people who need the money, right, to be in these arrangements, and oftentimes, like Maria was talking about earlier, have to exchange sex to get that money.
I think we often focus too much on quote-unquote success stories where someone may have had one interaction with someone on a site like this and ultimately they found it to be very pleasurable or maybe stopped, what have you. But instead we should be focusing on this larger picture of the majority of people who have a very traumatizing experience during this process. Afterwards, there are just so many severe consequences that are just inherent to engaging in any of these sites.
Right, and oftentimes people who have been through or who have had traumatic experiences with instances like sugaring or OnlyFans or pornography obviously have a much harder time talking about that publicly than people who are in a position of privilege and who, like you said, gained pleasure from those arrangements and being in these what are normally inherently exploitative trades.
Right.
So what we're really doing by giving more time and attention to this minority of experiences of empowerment, like you were talking about, that play out in the sex trade, where we are highlighting the most privileged people within these systems that most of the time exploit the most marginalized people who don't have the power to go online and share their story, and also they're dealing with trauma that they've experienced from this.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because it feels like a bit of a dichotomy between those who have the opportunity to explore, let's say, who like have the freedom to explore, the leisure to explore, the financial and social structure to explore any of these sites or arrangements. But on the other side, we see people who kind of self-select for these sites because it's the extension of their vulnerability or a traumatizing experience,
right,
or like a history of abuse and financial difficulty.
Yeah, so I think all in all, we can say that, you know, online facilitated sexual interactions are just as dangerous as
Or
what
if
is
not an
taking,
extension of
yeah,
prostitution.
an extension of prostitution, and is just as dangerous.